Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's Elephant Professional Lecture with Dr. Paul Dagenet, whose name sorry, I hope I'm not butchering too badly. This is one of the most fascinating, most awaited lectures I think that I've been looking forward to most. I've spent years and years and years watching elephants, and particularly in the lockdown live streams daily, watching elephants' trunks and seeing how they're able to put them to almost any use they choose, which must require an enormous amount of brain power on behalf of the elephant, and we know they have very large brains, but also the physical makeup of the elephant's trunk is something that is absolutely fascinating, and quite how they're able to get all of those muscles or bundles of muscles to get into all those positions is something that is as yet, or up until very recently, as yet unexplained. But Dr. Paulette had produced a paper on how an elephant uses their trunk as a hydrostat. Now, I don't even know what a hydrostat is. So I know what an elephant's trunk is. Please do let us know what's going on and let us know what you discovered. Over to you.
Thank you very much, John, for the introduction, and also thanks especially for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my presentation. Can you let me know if you can see it all right?
Got it perfectly, thank you.
Okay. So, as was mentioned by John, the topic of my talk today will be about the biomechanics of the elephant trunk. So what are the physical principles behind the motion of the trunk and its anatomy, and the link between form and function? So first of all, I would just like to say a few words about the laboratory in which I am working at the moment, which is called the LANE, which stands for Laboratory of Artificial and Natural Evolution. We are located in Geneva, in Switzerland, in the Department of Genetics and Evolution. And here's pictures of the people who work in the lab with me. So we have Professor Michel Milinkovic, Dr. Athanasia Tsika, who are the head of the lab. We are a very, very multidisciplinary lab. We have physicists, including me, a couple biologists, 3D artists, a lot of people working as animal technicians, lab technicians. So it's a very multidisciplinary approach to solve problems of biology, but really at the interface between biology and physics. So we study the evolution and development and the physics of skin appendages and skin colors in vertebrates. So you can see different reptiles, but also mammals, the hedgehog, the tenrec, and we try to really use approaches from physics to understand how these appendages form and develop. And also we're interested into understanding the patterning of skin through mechanical instabilities and Turing instabilities, which means the diffusion and the reaction of different molecules in the skin, which will give rise to different patterns of colors, but also of structures. And on the bottom right of the slide, you can see an image of the elephant skin. And this brings me to explain how we got into studying the elephant in general. So there was a project done in our lab a couple of years ago about the skin cracks of the elephant and how this helped for thermal regulation and to retain water and humidity in the skin. And so this is how we got into this fascinating animal. And here's just a picture of us being a bit silly in a park in Switzerland, in Geneva. And we're very lucky to be very well funded by different funding agencies in our lab. And I would like to invite you, if you want to know more about our lab, our group, to visit our website, where you can learn more about the different projects that are going on. And so let me go back to the main topic for today, which will be, as I said, the biomechanics of the elephant trunk. As John mentioned, we published a paper recently in Current Biology, which was titled Elephants Evolve Strategies Reducing the Biomechanical Complexity of Their Trunk. So we start from the idea that the trunk is an extremely complex organ, and we try to find the basic principles behind that complexity that allow the elephant to control and to tackle such complexity. And the main reason why this organ is so interesting for biophysicists is because it's a continuum manipulator. So if we think about articulated organisms like the human body, reptiles like lizards or snakes, they are made of serial joints. So they are articulated, and each of these joints, elbow, wrists, and so on, have a maximum of 6 degrees of freedom. So you can move in 3 dimensions in space, and you have always 3 different angles at maximum in which you can move, which means that they are restrained in their possible motion. In comparison, muscular hydrostats, which I will explain what that means, are continuous. So they can attain virtually an infinite number of degrees of freedom in an infinite number of different conformations. And this is, first of all, because they only rely on muscle shape changes to move. They don't rely on any bones. So there is no constraint with rigid structures inside. And these volume changes allow the trunk, the trunk of the elephant, the tongue. Our tongue is also a muscular hydrostat, or the tentacles of squids and octopi, to move in all these different directions. And the main element of a muscular hydrostat that underlies all of its biomechanics is that it has a constant volume. So hydrostat means the fluid is at a constant volume. So if you reduce the diameter, the object would elongate. And if you reduce the length, the diameter would increase. And so this is this compensation between diameter and length that underlies the motion of these organs. So we observe with great fascination how the trunk of an elephant can achieve a very, very large range of tasks. It is extremely versatile. It can carry very heavy loads up to 250 kilograms or sometimes even more. It can pick up a single blade of grass. So it's at the same time very robust and very delicate. And so this is a great inspiration for a new field in robotics that is called soft robotics, in which we see the emergence of new paradigms. So instead of constructing robots that are also mechanically constrained by joints, like our skeleton, roboticists are interested today in building soft robots. So no joints, no restriction due to rigid parts being articulated, but rather artificial controllers and muscles that rely on pneumatic muscles. So that also use these kind of hydrostatic principles to elongate and retract, which allows them much more versatility and a much larger amount of freedom for movement. We also see that the trunk can be a great inspiration for integrated sensorial elements, because the trunk, as we will see, is a very, very fine tactile organ. It can sense pressure, temperature, and we have found a very high density of mechanoreceptors, so tactile organs and so on inside the skin. And it's also a very great inspiration for 3D printing and designing novel materials, because the skin of the elephant is very particular. It's very, very flexible, but also very, very robust and resistant. So it can inspire material engineers in their work. And so the project that I'm going to talk about today is inscribed into a very vast multidisciplinary project, which aims at designing a soft robot. And this robot has the particularity of being flexible and robust, but also strong and delicate. And we are trying to use inspiration from nature, so to make use a biomimetic approach to build this universal manipulator. So our team in the laboratory in which I'm from is trying to gather as much information and basic principles from the natural organ, from the elephant trunk, to give this information to roboticists so that they can bring new ideas into their work in how to design these kind of robots. So the different partners are mentioned on the slide. So we have the Sant'Anna Scuola in Pisa, the Italian Institute of Technology also in Pisa, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Photocentric, which is located in England. So how do we do that? So here you can see that we traveled in March 2020 to South Africa in Bela Bela, in a place called Adventures with Elephant. And here you see Sean Hensman, with whom we worked, and the people that are in his team. We used methods that were initially designed for the movie industry to track the movements of the trunk in 3 dimensions. So you saw that we were brushing off the trunk to remove all the dust, and then placing these bands, these elastic bands, in which we had screwed some very, very, very reflective spherical markers. And we then set up something that looks like a movie set. So we have 10 different infrared cameras and also 2 normal video cameras to record the movements of the trunk. So we will eventually bring an elephant on our movie set, and so we can track all the conformations in 3 dimensions of the trunk as it manipulates different objects. And the goal of this is to be able to reconstruct the trajectories of the trunk in 3 dimensions and to extract principles about the biomechanics of this movement. And also to understand what are the prehension strategies of the elephant when we give the animal different objects of different size, different shapes, different weights. How will the elephant adjust his prehension strategies? How will it grab a small object versus a large object, and so on? So the first part of my talk will be about these transitions in prehension strategies. So you see already in the drawing that we had different objects made out of wood, and we worked with 2 elephants at Adventures with Elephants with Sean Hensman. We had 1 elephant that was like a normal healthy elephant with 2 fingers at the tip, and 1 that had an accident a few years ago, and unfortunately the 2 tip fingers were sectioned. And so this allowed us to compare what will be the strategies of an elephant to grab an object when it can use these tip fingers, or when it's obliged to find alternatives because these fingers are not present in its trunk. And the different objects that we used for our experiments are illustrated here. So you see that we focused on 4 different aspects. The first one was the shape. So we had spheres, cubes, cylinders, cones, and discs. We changed the dimensions of these objects. So we went from very small ones of about 3-4 centimeters up to much larger objects with a diameter, for example, for the sphere of 30 centimeters. And then we changed the mass density or the weight of the objects. So we had different materials. We had objects made out of wood, which were the most the lightest objects. And then we had other made of aluminum, which was an intermediate weight. And then we went to very heavy spheres, for example, made out of steel. And finally, we tested the effect of the texture of the object. So we had some spheres carved with little holes in them to make them more rough. And we also covered some of the spheres with lubricant oil, such that it would be very slippery. And the question was, how will the elephant handle all these objects? And so the result of our study is presented here. So I hope that you will be able to see the movie properly. It presents a catalog of 17 prehension strategies. So we found out that the elephant was combining different strategies together. So either using the tip fingers to make a tip grip, or sometimes using the tip to make a suction, and then going on with a distal flip to secure the object. And each behavior could be used in combination with other behaviors. So we found out that the motion of the trunk and the behaviors is composed a little bit like a language, in which the words or the metaphorical words would be basic movements. So the elephant is presented with an object, and depending on the task to achieve a success of transporting the object from point A to point B, it will combine these different basic motions to make sure that the object is transported properly without dropping it. So you see here, for example, the animal that is missing its tip fingers had to adjust to other strategies. So instead of, for example, using tip grip or suction, it had to roll the trunk around the object for a full trunk wrap. Sometimes complementary motion were used, like rolling the objects closer before picking it up, or bowing down towards the object to press it down, applying pressure and then lifting it up. And sometimes even some kicks with the trunk were made in order to change the orientation of the object before picking it up. And we saw some behaviors also where the elephant is handing its trunk like a basket to receive the object. And one thing that was very fascinating was to see this trunk-foot coordination that was very beautiful in both animals. They were capable of combining the trunk and the feet to lift objects, and even combining the trunk with relief on the ground to use it as a lever in order to pick up the objects. So you see that the trunk is pushing the object against a crack to use it as a lever. And finally, which seems like a playful behavior, the elephant was also using its tusks to secure the object for a while, especially with the large cylinder, as you can see. So now that we have a catalog of all these behaviors, we were interested in quantifying the frequency of each behavior. So how much percent, or what is the probability of using a certain behavior when handed a certain type of objects? And here's the result for the elephant with an intact tip. I will explain to you what we're seeing, because I know this is a graph. It can look complicated, but it's not. The color represents the probability of using a certain behavior. So 0 would be blue. If you see blue, that means that for this object, the elephant would never use this behavior. And red is 1. It's the maximum probability. So it means that in 100% of the cases, we saw that the elephant used this particular behavior for this particular object. And you see on the horizontal line, you have the different objects with the dimension that goes from small, D1, to large objects, D4. Or on the right, you see that the mass goes from the mass of wood, so light objects, M1, to heavy objects made out of steel, M3. And so what I want you to notice is that there's a real trend in the distribution of the behaviors, which is very clear, indicated by this arrow. And it shows that when we increase either the size of the objects from D1 to D4, or when we increase the mass of the objects from M1 to M3, the elephant will transition from certain behaviors, starting from the tip grip and pinching and suction, towards behaviors that involve the whole trunk, like distal wrap of the trunk, full trunk wrap, and so on. And so we see that there's really robust transitions as a function of size and mass of the objects. And now what happens if we look at the same type of results, but for the trunk that is missing its tip fingers? You see that the transitions are no longer visible. So first of all, we see that the range of attainable behaviors has shrinked. So some behaviors that were initially used by the elephant with intact tip, such as pinching or gripping with the 2 fingers, are not available for this elephant with severe tip. So the range of behavior is narrower, and we don't see as clear transitions. So this was the first finding of our study, was to describe these behavioral transitions. And then we went into more mathematical approach to quantify the kinematics and the motion of the trunk. So here's a very simple in appearance motion, which is just suction of a disc, transport from right to left, and then the same motion from left to right again. So very symmetrical motion. And we are tracking the little markers. You see that they are now colored, which means that this was processed by computer algorithms to reconstruct the trajectory of the markers in 3 dimensions, and we can project their motion on the actual image recorded by a normal video camera. And what we do with those reconstructed trajectories is we create a model of the trunk, or a model of the movement of the trunk in time. So you see that we go from dark blue to light green to represent the motion in time. And all the rows of markers are now represented by an ellipse or some sort of deformed circle. And so this is what we constructed to have a model of the trunk to be able to really measure in time and in space the deformation, so elongation, shortening, and also the speed at which it moves, how much it bends, how much it twists. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all these different types of motion. So the first thing that I want to mention is that for such a sequence, when the elephant picks up an object, transports it from point A to point B, we find that there's 5 phases of motion. And these 5 phases are reaching the object, reaching for the object, prehension, so grabbing the object, transporting the object, releasing it, and then reaching back to resting pose. And it's very interesting that when we measure different variables during the trajectory, we can really see very distinctly these 5 phases of motion, as you can see here. So let me explain this graph. This shows the speed of the trunk, how fast it's moving. The color bar is in meters per second. So if you see red, it means it's going very fast, about 2.5 meters per second. And blue is, it's not moving at all, it's immobile. And on the vertical axis, we call this the trunk index. And this shows the position on the trunk. So if you're at 0, you're very close to the head. So the first row of markers placed on the forehead. And then we go down the trunk up to the trunk index 1, which is the very tip of the trunk, or the last row of markers at the tip. And the horizontal axis is time. So you can see the distribution of speed or velocity on the trunk from the head to the tip as a function of time. And we see that the trunk will go faster in certain phases of motion. And this is very interesting to see that when we look at this particular trajectory from right to left and then left to right, which is the symmetrical motion of the trunk, the peaks in speed or the peaks in velocity are very well reproduced. This means that the elephant is not moving randomly. It's choosing to execute a particular motion with the trunk with very well planned velocity profile, which is reproduced when you're doing twice the same motion or a symmetrical motion from one side to the other. And we see that these peaks are very well reproduced. And it shows that the movement is very well planned and executed. Now let's look at another type of deformation, which is, or another type of variable that we can measure, which is the elongation of the trunk. So that's one of the most fascinating aspects of the trunk, is its capacity for a very, very large elongation compared to most organs. And you can see here that we represent the elongation with a color scale again. So red means that the trunk is elongating, and blue means that the trunk is contracting. So this is represented also on the graph on the right side of the slide. Again, the vertical axis shows the position on the trunk from 0 on the forehead to 1 on the tip of the trunk. And we see this unfolding as a function of time. So how many seconds in the trajectory. And it's exactly what you see on the right is projected exactly on the model that you see on the left. So you see that it's interesting that actually the trunk is elongating in a modular way, which means that it's not elongating homogeneously everywhere on the trunk at once. It's elongating certain portions and retracting certain portions sequentially during the motion. So you see that at some moment when it's reaching or when it's in its maximally elongated state, the trunk has two red spots, and these are the two maximally elongated parts, and the range goes from 30% elongation to minus 30%, so retraction. And so we have two spots of 30% elongation on the trunk. So it's really a modular way. Certain portions will elongate while other portions retract. And so it's very interesting that the trunk is being decomposed in these different parts that behave not at all the same at the same time. Now, if we look again at the exact same type of deformation, so elongating and shortening, but we look not only at the elongations in length, but also in diameter. Because as we said in the beginning, the trunk is a muscular hydrostat, which means that its volume should stay constant in principle. That means that if the length reduces, the diameter should increase to compensate. And if the diameter reduces, the length should increase to compensate, to keep a constant volume. And so we went and measured with our little markers, ellipse, and our model of the trunk. We measured as a function of time, the change in diameter and the change in length. And you can see that these two curves, so the blue curve is the diameter and the green curve is the length, they really compensate in time. So this is exactly what we predicted for a muscular hydrostat. But if we actually calculate the volume contained in our trunk model, we see that there's a little bit of compressibility. Compressibility means that the volume is not always exactly constant. There is a volume change of roughly plus minus 5% during the trajectories that we analyzed, which corresponds to a length change of about plus minus 15%. So this is actually consistent with very recent work that has been done in another group from Georgia Tech University. And it's a person that spoke at one of these lectures recently, Andrew Schultz, and his professor, David Hu, published a paper which was talking about this compressibility of the trunk related to the dilation of the nostrils. So our results are in agreement with what they presented. And so this is very interesting to find out that the trunk uses its nostril also to participate in the deformations, elongating, shortening of the trunk. Now we go to another type of deformation, which is the curvature, so bending the trunk, and torsion, twisting the trunk. So let's go back to our model with the ellipses and the markers, and we see that we can measure how much the trunk bends up and down at any moment of the trajectory, how much it bends left and right. So these two are different type of curvature, up, down, or left, right. And we have the torsion, which is the twisting of the trunk. And by quantifying these different deformations, we found that the elephant uses simplification strategies, because as we said in the beginning, it's extremely complex to control an organ that is a continuum that has an almost infinite number of degrees of freedom. So we hypothesized that there must exist some simplification strategies for the elephant to be able to encode the motion and plan these type of motion in 3D space. And we found indeed that one of these strategies is to simply propagate a curvature front along the trunk. So bending, for example, from the tip and then propagating this bending along the organ. What's most interesting about this finding is that it has been observed not only in the muscular hydrostat of the elephant trunk, but in other muscular hydrostat, which have nothing to do from an evolutionary point of view with a trunk, such as the octopus arm. So you see here that when reaching for a target, this has been done by another group, the octopus will send a bend across its arm to propagate the arm up to the target. So in the reaching phase of motion. And interestingly, the trunk does something similar, but in a different phase of motion. So not when reaching for a target, but actually after it has grabbed a target, when reaching back and when transporting this object, the elephant will propagate a bend or curvature front from the tip to the base. So it's literally the opposite motion as what was observed in the octopus. But it's very interesting to find that different muscular hydrostats converge to similar simplification mechanisms for their motion. And it suggests that these are probably optimal in some point of view for moving such a complex organ. So what it looks like when you propagate a curvature front, for example, in this type of motion, you see that the elephant starts bending at the tip and that the bending goes up and down. And when we quantify this, we see that it propagates from the tip, so from the trunk index number 1, and it goes up. So the blue represents the curvature or the bending. It goes up to the forehead, so trunk index 0 in time, and then it goes back down. And so these type of graphs that you can see here in this little pyramid blue shape, we called those motion primitives. And this is a term that has been used before to describe complex motion in many different animals, when you can actually decompose the motion of an appendage, a leg, an arm, an elephant trunk, and so on, when you can decompose the motion like a language into building blocks. And these are like the building blocks of motion. And when you combine them together, so these type of bending with the torsion and so on, these patterns of bending and torsion, they make up the complex motion from simpler building blocks. And when you look at different behaviors, you will see that these motion primitives look differently. So the different graphs that I'm showing here, they correspond to the curvature front propagation on the trunk for different objects. So cylinders of different size, different mass, or even a sphere. And you see that when we change the attribute of the object, the elephant adapts its motion primitives or the ingredients of motion to account for the different attributes of the object. And so different behaviors give rise to different motion primitives. This was one of the main findings of our study, that we can actually decompose motion in these simpler building blocks, and that we can see that the motion is encoded through these kinematic maps. Now, something that was also very impressive to see was that another simplification mechanism of the elephant trunk is to form virtual joints when it has to make a point-to-point movement. And again, very fascinating, this has been observed before in the octopus arm. And so in this case, when the octopus has finally reached for the target, a piece of fish, for example, and it wants to reach back with the target to bring it to its mouth. So this is what we call a point-to-point motion. So it goes from the initial position of the target to the mouth. It will create these 3 virtual joints, one at the basis, another one that almost looks like an elbow, and the third one almost, we can make the analogy with as having a wrist. And these 3 different quasi-articulated positions will allow very precise displacement of the target from one point to the other. So this is in the reaching back phase of motion. And as you can see in this really beautiful picture that was taken at Adventures with Elephant with one of the elephant handlers that worked with us during our experiments, the elephant actually creates the impression of an elbow and a wrist as well by making very sharp twists and bends at precise locations, which really makes it look like a human arm, if you want to make this analogy. And we found that this motion or this strategy was used mainly when doing point-to-point motion. So when reaching for a treat, when the handler was handing a treat to the animal, it would reach to the side and back with this type of elbow and wrist configuration. And when we quantify these different deformations for the quasi-articulated conformation, we find that it is actually the distribution of bending and twisting along the trunk that give the impression of an elbow and a wrist. So I'm going to play it again. So the movie that you saw on the right shows the distribution of twisting. So red means a lot of twisting is happening in this region. The final mathematical information that I'm going to give you is also, I would say, the most mysterious that we found out. So it has been observed in many animals, in different organisms, that there exists a special law between speed and path curvature. So it's actually very intuitive that if you're moving in a sharp curve, you tend to slow down. And so this gives this simple mathematical relation between velocity or speed, which is proportional to the curvature of the trajectory with a certain exponent. So first example that was found out in 1983 was for human drawing movement. So if you ask someone to draw on a paper and you record at which speed the hand is moving, and at the same time you record how sharp are the curves of the drawing, you find that the hand will slow down in sharp curves, and not with any relation, but with a specific relationship between speed and curvature that uses the exponent in this equation of -1/3. And then if you look at another case, if you ask someone to actually walk on a drawing, depending on the path geometry of the drawing on the floor, this exponent will be in a certain range. And how much the tongue, the tip of our tongue, slows down when we move our tongue in our mouth, depending on the curvature of the trajectory of our tongue, also follows this very special mathematical law with another exponent, p. And this depends on the frequency. So if I make a certain sound like ta, 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 or ko, 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 my tongue will move along a certain trajectory and will slow down in the curves. And finally, something that is also a very different organism, the larva of the fruit fly, when it moves in space, also slows down in sharp curves with another exponent. And so we asked, of course, what about the elephant trunk? And we went and measured the relationship between the speed of the tip of the trunk and the curvature of the path. And we found that this law is also obeyed by the elephant trunk with an exponent of -2/3. Now, I have to admit that this remains a mystery. It is still to be studied. What is the significance of these laws, and are they linked to mechanical performance? So there's been a lot of talk in the biomechanical scientific world about what is the significance of these laws, and are they related to animal trying to be more precise or more efficient and spending less energy and so on. And I can not give you the answer today, but this is a beautiful topic, and I know that it will be followed on by other scientists. And so now let's talk about anatomy. We studied the internal anatomy of the trunk in fine details, and I'm running a bit out of time, so I'll try to go a bit quicker over this. So here you can see traveling inside the trunk from the tip until the basis of the trunk. And so what we did is we took a trunk of an animal that was unfortunately deceased in a zoo, and we sectioned the whole trunk in slices of about 1 centimeter thick, imaged them at very high resolution in order to study the arrangement of every muscle fiber in the trunk and understand how are all these movements that we just described produced by the musculature of the trunk, and really draw a bridge between form and function. So you see here different cross sections of the trunk from the basis to the tip. We also not only cut a trunk in serial sections, but we also put it in an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging scanner, in which we could really, again, in very fine resolution, capture all the orientation of the fibers, and we segmented the different muscle groups in the trunk. So there's 6 main muscle groups in the trunk. There's the longitudinal, radial dorsal, radial ventral, deep and superficial obliques, and the transversal central, of course. And so these 6 muscle groups, they are oriented in different directions, and they allow to do this muscular hydrostat motion of compensating diameter and length. So that was for the African elephant. Now I'm showing you some other images, because we also did the exact same work with an Asian elephant, and we sectioned not just in transversal sections, but also in coronal sections, so from the top to the bottom, and also sagittal sections, so from left to right. And we really opened up in great detail all the arrangement of nerves, vessels, muscle fibers, connective tissue, and we unveiled a lot of unknown details about the internal arrangement of the trunk. So especially we were very interested in the prehensile tip because it's a very specialized organ. And we looked at the difference between the African and Asian elephant, which, as you probably know, the main difference resides in the fact that the African elephant has 2 mobile fingers, but the Asian elephant has 1 dorsal fingers facing double stumps. And having studied the anatomy and the motion, we were able to talk about muscular synergy. So how the muscle are combined to produce the motion. So for example, in this example of torsion, we have a right-handed twist of the trunk. Because we knew the exact orientation of the fibers of each muscle groups, we were able to pin down which muscle groups are acting at which moment and where on the trunk. And also in another example, when the trunk is doing an inward bend to lift an object, which results in negative curvatures, we were again able to understand which muscle groups are involved to shorten the ventral side while contracting the core in order to make that inward bend, because we knew exactly what the angle of these fibers were. And we know from previous work from William Keir that there's a critical angle below which the oblique muscles will contract the trunk when they retract, or above which they will extend the trunk when they contract. And in the case of the elephant trunk, we're below this critical angle. So the oblique muscles of the trunk are actually making it a contractor. Now, a big question is, how can the nerves sustain such high elongation in the trunk? And so we went and took a very fine piece of nerve, which you can see in the yellow square, and we used a method in biology called histology, which consists in slicing very microscopic amount of tissue and staining these little pieces with special dyes which color different structures. So here we see the nerves in a cross section on top and in the longitudinal section of the nerve. And we found out that the undulation of the nerves give them capability to elongate without even stretching the nerves. You can elongate the nerve by a great percentage just by unmaking this undulation. And finally, because in the objective of building a robot and building integrated sensing elements and making novel materials for the skin and so on, we paid great attention to the skin and the mechanoreceptors that are inside. So without going into too much details, we looked at the skin layers such as the epidermis, the dermis, the tendinous sheet that is just around the muscles. And we found very beautiful mechanoreceptors. So Meissner's corpuscles, which are for light touch, Pacinian corpuscles, which allows to sense surface texture. So I'm coming to the end of my talk, and so I would like to invite you to visit the website that we made for this project. The link is right here. And we had the chance to collaborate with art and design school in Geneva. And the students in the school made beautiful illustrations for our projects, which we use in our website. So I think you'll enjoy it. And you can download an interactive application to explore these results that I just presented. So first, the basic kinematic principles of the elephant trunk. You can move in 3 dimensions the model of the trunk and slide the timer. You can look at different sequences with different objects and choose which type of variables you want to project on the trunk: curvature, elongation, torsion, speed, and so on. And you can also use another online interactive application to actually explore the anatomy, outer anatomy, skin in fine detail, and inner anatomy, the different muscle groups. You can go through all these high resolution images that I showed from the serial sections. And so you can really explore all the data set. We made it publicly available on this website. And finally, there's a section for virtual reality. And we made, first of all, a 360 degrees movie when we were at Adventures with Elephants, working with Sean Hensman and his team. And so you can see in 360, the whole setup with the infrared cameras and the people that work with us, and Chishuru, who is the the main actor of our study. So that's the elephant that you see there, who developed great prehension capacities with all the objects that we gave to him. So this is for the 360 video. And we also made an application, which is for virtual reality for Oculus Quest, which is these VR casks that some people have in institutions or at home. You can download an application for this. So with this, I thank you very much for your attention. Thanks again for the invitation, John. And I would like to acknowledge the fact that this work was made not just by me, but with many different people from our lab, Sean Hansman, a lot of people at Adventures with Elephants that worked with us. And I thank everybody who contributed. And let's open for questions.
Great, thank you very much. A lot to think about, and I hope we've got some vets. If not, we're certainly going to be sharing the anatomy of the elephant's trunk link with our Thai vets as well, because they're fascinating. Normally at this stage, I would invite you to come and do some research with us, but I think our elephants would just break all your nice equipment. How did you? Well, the elephants just didn't do it. Our elephants tend to break equipment, but if we find a way to stop them doing that, please come and do it for the Asian elephants with us.
It would be our pleasure. It would be a great complementary study to do the same thing with the Asian elephant.
Before we go on to other people's questions, did you work with just 2 elephants, or did you bring more able trunked elephants on board?
So the answer to your question is related to the comments that you made just before about the elephants breaking equipment. And so we had to be very careful to, first of all, find elephants that would be tamed in order to first receive the markers. So we were placing these kinesiology tapes. So you might have used them on your sore muscles if you do sports with the markers screwed inside. Not every elephant likes to have things stick on its trunk, and the elephant needs to be very, very friendly and collaborative. So when we worked at Adventures with Elephants, we had to rule out certain individuals that would not react very favorably to having markers placed on their trunks. And also, as you say, this is a very sensitive equipment, but even though it was placed quite far from the elephant, we had to make sure that the elephant would not start rushing through the cameras. And we had some very hot moments when the elephant got a little bit annoyed not being able to pick up a large sphere or a very large cone, and actually kicked the object straight into our cameras. And I think that we were just extremely lucky that nothing got broken. But yeah, the reason why we used 2 elephants was because out of the couple of elephants that were on site, we had to focus on these 2 individuals that were very receptive. And we were able during 10 days to record hundreds of sequences with these 2 animals, which we have not even analyzed all of these sequences because it's a tremendous amount of data. But it would be very interesting for sure to complement with maybe juvenile individuals or from another species, and to see if we change other factors, how would that affect the prehension strategies?
Yeah, well, if we're allowed to rule elephants out, then you're certainly welcome. Yeah, it would be fascinating. Just the way that I'm thinking that if we watch elephants foraging, different elephants have different techniques to achieve the same task. Presumably, what would be lovely to find, and I know as a scientist you don't want to find things, you just find what you find and explain it, but it would be lovely to find that they use the same techniques but in slightly different ways, what the common denominators are. So yeah, let's look at that as time goes on. We have several other people on the Zoom who've joined us. Would you like to, I can't see you unfortunately, but would you like to unmute yourselves and ask some questions? If not, we'll go straight to Facebook.
Hi, hello. I definitely have a couple questions.
Okay, Markin, go away. Introduce yourself first, please, and then speak.
Yeah, hi, I'm Markin, second-year vet student at New Zealand right now. So we're doing this pretty late in the night. It's almost 10 o'clock right now. Almost 11 actually. But yeah, gee, I found this really interesting, and I got a couple questions. one of them that was really kind of in my mind for most of it was just about the forces that go into the musculature in that trunk there. You kind of touched on it a little more when you were talking about the muscular synergy and how each muscle group plays in at each part of the trunk. But is there a way to maybe measure or estimate like the exact isometric and isotonic forces that are going into those muscles at each point in the trunk?
That's a great question. And I have to say that this project is not closed. We are working, as I said in the beginning, in collaboration with roboticists. And so right now, what we have done is we have shared all of our data, all of our analysis with people who work at the Italian Institute of Technology and the Santa Ana Scuola in Pisa. And we're collaborating with them right now because they are working on developing a more mathematical model of the trunk in which they are actually able to measure forces. Because to measure forces in the actual elephant would demand methods that would be too intrusive. First of all, we would probably not get the ethical permits to do this, and it would be very difficult with such animals that are never totally tamed, of course. But by using the kinematic data and also the anatomical data, we can make a model and in this model, we can numerically measure the forces. And so for the moment, I don't have any results to share on that because I know that my colleagues and collaborators in Italy are working right now on this. And I hope that the results will be out in a few months and that you can read more about this. Yeah.
Cool. I also had a question about those virtual joints there. Did you find that those virtual joints occur at like the same places throughout different activities that they had to do, or occurred all the time, or they kind of changed based on what they were doing?
So this is a question that I've gotten a lot: is do they make the joints always at the same point? And is there anything in the anatomy related to that point?
Yeah, like the musculature.
Yeah, and so I think that it would be very interesting to answer that question by making the same experiments with more different individuals. What I can say is in that particular individual in which we observed these joint-like conformations, it was always made in the same purpose or the same task, which was a little bit of an accidental task because it was to retrieve a treat from the animal handler after having achieved the actual task. And so when the handler was always placed at the side, a little bit to the back of the elephant, the position, so I quantified the distribution of curvature and torsion along the trunk for different instances of that joint-like conformation. And I found that the distribution were very, very much symmetrical. I didn't want to show them here because it would be a little bit too, maybe too many graphs. I think there was enough already, but you could see the distribution of curvature, the distribution of torsion happened, and it's not that located. Surprisingly, curvature and torsion are localized, but it's like a, like some kind of Gaussian bell shape. But the center of that curve was pretty much located always at the same time, even when the movement was done to the right or to the left, it was very symmetrical, but for the same individual and for the same task. So if it would be interesting to see with other individuals what the answer would be, if it's dependent on the morphology, but I can only answer for that particular individual.
Really interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, thank you. Any more questions from Zoom?
Hi, I've got a question.
Yes, please, Gina.
I just wanted to ask, what would be like the future, like further progress and kind of like the ultimate goal of these findings? Like, what would GB hope to achieve with this information and the ultimate goal?
Good question. Why did we do that, and what's the purpose of it? So I would say that from my personal point of view, the purpose is to understand nature, understand the complexity of motion in an organ that is very, very different from the human body, that has this continuum characteristics. And the more practical goal of the project is to inspire the design of soft robots. So try to understand how nature does things, how a continuum manipulator chooses a certain trajectory instead of another one. So if you go from point A to point B, why did the trunk go like this and not like this? Why does it choose to bend at a certain point and not another point when it can actually bend everywhere along the trunk? So understand how nature does things and try to extract principles from this, which would mean, for example, understanding what is being optimized, if something is being optimized, first of all. For example, if you find out that the elephant chooses certain trajectory to be more precise, or to be quicker, or to spend less energy, or to have a higher chance of achieving a success in the task. So will it choose to do it more quickly, or with a compromise of sometimes dropping the object? And understanding these different compromises in what are called cost functions in trajectory analysis. And all this information can, of course, be a great inspiration for engineers, because when they design a robot, there's literally an infinite way that the robot can move from point A to point B, especially if it's a continuum. And to understand what are the constraints that nature chooses, or what are the functions that nature chooses to optimize, can inspire engineers to follow these guidelines or not. Because as we found out by speaking often with the roboticists and engineers, sometimes it doesn't make sense to imitate nature, because nature is not always the most optimized design. So I would say that this is the goal of our project. Yeah.
So something similar to kind of like endoscopy?
Similar to
endoscopy?
Can you explain what you mean?
Like, for example, like with like surgical procedures, how like there's kind of like that mechanical tool that
yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't understand. But yes, so a soft robot could indeed be used in medicine. It's already the case where these soft manipulators are used to go inside the body, because, of course, if you don't have articulated joints in a robot and rather a very flexible conformation, you can go in any environment without damaging the environment, because you don't have these restricted positions at which you can move. So indeed, endoscopy would be a very good application, but also let's say that there's an environmental disaster like an earthquake or so on, and then you have debris accumulated on the ground and you want to go rescue someone or explore a very unknown and maybe dangerous terrain, and you go in with something that's soft, which can dig much more easily and conform to different obstacles much more easily rather than an articulated arm. This could be a very great application for soft robots. And literally anything that has to do with interacting with humans and animals, because imagine that you're trying to help somebody that is impaired physically to lift up or stand up, and you have this machine that is very rigid in joints. It's more prone to injuring the person or to not be perfectly conforming to different people's bodies. So soft robots have this versatility that is very precious, but hard to achieve, of course.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, that's reminded me of something that was very interesting again about your findings between the two elephants. That assuming that an elephant's trunk must be very energetically expensive. So assuming that it will always take the easier, the less energetic way of doing things, the fact that it made me appreciate more. Or when we look at an elephant with an injured trunk tip, we tend to think of it, oh, this must be problematic. But your graph showed quite how problematic it was, that they had to immediately go for the highly energetic way of moving that object, rather than as the elephant with the non-injured tip was able to start off even with light objects and easy objects with much easier ways of working. So an elephant with an injured trunk tip would be using more energy. So it's just an interesting observation.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Any more questions on the Zoom, or shall we go to Facebook? Do you have any questions? Or
Yes, from Julia. The question is, are Asian and African elephants trunk similar enough that the research applies for both?
I wouldn't want to go as far as to answer this question with certainty, because what we did was study the anatomy of Asian and elephant trunks. So we saw that the bulk of the musculature is very similar in both. So we even measured the percentage of the total volume occupied by each muscle group, and this was very well preserved. And the orientation of the fibers, there were more difference in the skin, I have to say, in the thickness of the different skin layers and the way that it cracks, but also in the tip, which is of course morphologically different, as we talked about with the different 2 fingers in the African elephant and only 1 finger in the Asian one. But as to say how the Asian elephant trunk would move in the face of the same tasks, I can only make a hypothesis. So my impression is that the tip fingers are less versatile in the Asian elephant. And so it would maybe tend to use more the whole trunk strategies, a little bit like the injured elephant, so the one that was missing its fingers. I'm not sure that the Asian elephant is able to use suction as efficiently as the African elephant. I'm not sure if the tip grip would be as finely controlled without the ventral finger. So we might see that certain behaviors are maybe harder to execute for the Asian elephant, and then it would restrain its strategies to more the whole trunk strategies. But this is only a hypothesis.
That's why you should come here to do more research.
I'm taking this as an invitation.
Okay, another one from Julia as well. Would there be value to coordinating this research with what is going on in the elephant brain?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Would there be value to coordinating this research with what is going on in the elephant brain, and in what parts?
I'm sorry, but I don't understand the question.
The brain. Could we have, is there any way to look inside the brain at the same time as the
That's
trunk?
a hard question, actually. So in theory, we could use functional magnetic resonance imaging or electromyograms to look at what type of brain regions are activated and exactly how they relate to which type of muscle fibers firing during a sequence. And then we could map which regions of the brain are in contact with which regions of the trunk and so on. But this, in principle, would be very, very hard to achieve because of regulations in using these invasive approach with protected species and just mammal species in general. And also the implementation of such methods with elephants would be very, very difficult to achieve. So up to now, it's very difficult to really measure directly what happens in the brain. So we can only, at least in our study, we could only infer from the kinematics the idea that the motion is encoded with building blocks, but how these building blocks are then expressed at the neuronal level is not something that we have been able to answer yet. But it is a very interesting question, and also it would be very interesting to see how the innervation of the trunk is made. How is every single bundle activated individually? So how much localization is possible in the trunk? So there's a lot to find out yet. And we only scratched the surface. So regarding neural control, this is not something that we really digged in our study, but it would be very interesting to study this. Yeah.
Okay, another question from Veronica Power. He just from observing this visible muscle contraction of the trunk, do you think one can infer nostril dilution, or are these independent?
Mm-hmm. So I think that we could infer, not with 100% certainty, but if we say that we see that the trunk has a volume change of 5% during a certain sequence, in principle, muscles are made of almost only water. So this part of the trunk cannot be easily compressed, at least not by 5%. So it would take tremendous force to reduce the volume of a cube of muscle by 5%. So this volume change, we are almost certain that it is due to dilation or contraction of the nostrils. So we could use just geometrical formulas to say how much would I have to increase the diameter of my nostrils such that the total volume of the trunk would change by this amount, and so on. So we could use just geometrical principles to make as was said in the questions, to infer the nostril change. But I know that this has been measured directly by the people that I mentioned. So Andrew Schultz and David Hoody use ultrasound imaging to actually measure the change in diameter. And I think that I'm correct, but they could correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that the nostril change was in agreement with what we found with this volume change of about 5%.
So basically, for me who's a bit daft, what you're saying is that with your calculations of length and diameter, it looks as though the trunk is not actually a hydrostat, it's changing volume, but you know that would be technically impossible. So you think you're pretty sure that the unviewable bit is the nostril, so they must be doing something in there. Yes?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So you can imagine that if the trunk changes nothing else than its nostril size, if it dilates the nostril, this would actually compress the volume of the muscle in the diameter direction, and it would actually contribute to elongating the trunk.
Got it. Thank you.
Another question, John, can you please read? I just sent to the chat. Not sure if I understand this one. Sorry.
Okay, from Celeste Ho, who says, this was absolutely fascinating. Right, would the versatility of soft robots or hydrostats potentially compromise strength and robusticity, how robust they are, found in conventional robots with skeletons? If so, how would one balance between the two?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I understand your question, it's how is this trade-off between versatility and robustness handled in the trunk and in robots. And so this is the reason why the trunk is so fascinating, as I said in the beginning, is because it's capable of very delicate and fine motion, but at the same time can be very, very robust and strong and carry very heavy loads. And so how this is handled is by this principle of muscular hydrostat. So by the fact that you locally have an increase of stiffness when you would contract the trunk locally, which can almost give it the robustness of a bone. So by locally making these contractions, you can have elements of the trunk which becomes very, very rigid and robust to press against objects or to resist deformations. So it's the fact that these structures are entirely composed of muscles, that they are capable of first of all, creating all these different motions, but also locally stiffening and being as robust almost as a completely rigid object. As to how this can be translated in a robot, that's very challenging. So creating a robot that only relies on soft parts and pneumatic actuators or fluidic actuators, but is capable of lifting very, very heavy loads. This is an open challenge right now that our colleagues and collaborators are trying to solve. And I think that they will be able to answer this question better than me, because of course the idea is not to create a one-by-one replication of the trunk with something that is exactly the same and works the same. So they have to innovate and find ideas that maybe are not present in nature, because robots cannot, first of all, can usually not be as complicated as nature. So if we have 6 muscle groups in the real trunk, there probably will be 2 differently orientated actuators in the artificial manipulator. So simplifying this complexity and reproducing the same strength is very challenging indeed.
There's no more question from Facebook. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so if there are no more questions, and yes, I have personally felt the wrath of an elephant's trunk, and I can tell you they are quite robust when they want to be, and as you say, immediately incredibly delicate when they want to be also. So fantastic! Thank you very much, Paul. That was
Thank you so much for the invitation.
That was a brilliant talk. Please do, as I say, if you need to do it, when you come around and you want to do Asian elephants, come and think of us. We do have elephants who probably should stand still long enough for you, he said, thinking, and won't necessarily, and we'll keep you well away from the elephants who definitely won't and will definitely come and try and eat your equipment. And yet, please do keep in touch and let us know of any developments, because as I said at the beginning, genuinely, I spend a lot of my time, and we all do, watching elephants, and the trunk is perhaps the most fascinating. But there's many fascinating bits about elephants, but the trunk is one bit that fascinates us. So to learn more and to learn more so accurately has been fantastic. So, and also
my pleasure.
to sort of to make your paper and the findings on the website, which I haven't had a look at yet, so accessible from such a complex subject is brilliant. So thank you very much for that work as well.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
That's it. And I think that's about it. I think next week we are back to elephant osteopathy with Dr. Tony Nevin. His second talk, because we didn't know what we were doing and didn't manage to record the first one. Yes, back with an elephant lockdown live stream, completely unscientific, just me and a camera and elephants, which I think is tomorrow morning. So until then, those of you who've joined us for the first time, please do like the Facebook page. Do have a look at our previous professional lectures as well. And Marky, and you might want to have a look also, because they at Andrew Schultz's lecture about elephant trunks and force, because I think, as you say, he did go some way to answering those questions, but not in an elegant way, I think, as you're planning to do with all the mathematics and everything. But I can tell you that there's an immense amount of force, and it would be amazing to see how that force is applied and precisely where it's applied. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Paula, for talking, and we will see you. I'll see you again when the next paper is out. Good luck with all the work, and thank you for both bringing physics to the elephant's trunk and then explaining it to us in a way that we can understand.
Thank you.